Welcome to the ASU's Future Security Initiative Fall Speaker Series for 2023. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're really thrilled to have our colleague Joanna Naples-Mitchell with us. She's going to be talking about when will the U.S. provide promised condolence payments for survivors of military operations from the post 9/11 war. And Joanna is a human rights lawyer. She's a research fellow with the Future Security Initiative, and she's the director of the Redress Program at the Zomia Center. And there she assists survivors of U.S. military operations in receiving condolence payments from a special Department of Defense fund that was created for this purpose. Prior to joining Zomia, Joanna worked at Physicians for Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, and the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions section of the U.S. Department of Justice. She has a JD from New York University School of Law and a BA from Harvard University. And we're thrilled, Joanna, to have you join us this evening. We'll have a presentation from Joanna first, and then follow up with some questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you to everyone for being here tonight and for watching online after. So as Daniel mentioned, my name is Joanna. I work at an organization headquartered in New York called the Zomia Center. We are a nonprofit that has a staff of over 170 people, the majority of whom work in Syria and other parts of the Middle East. We were founded in 2017 by a group of journalists and researchers who had worked in conflict zones and other spaces that did not have a functioning central government, and really found that there was a gap in knowledge and in service delivery in these spaces. They founded Zomia to fill that gap. Zomia was formally incorporated as a nonprofit in 2019, and since then, we have developed projects in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, including the one that I run, which focuses on condolence payments, as Daniel mentioned. So first, the theme of this talk is about when will the U.S. provide these payments. So I'm going to start with just taking a step back, giving you some context on what condolence payments are, where this came from, and specifically the U.S. fund that's referenced, what that means and what that comes from. So the U.S. has offered some form of monetary payment as a token of apology or sympathy to civilians harmed in U.S. military operations for decades. There was some version of this in the Korean War in the 50s. There was a version of this in Vietnam. The modern incarnation originated in the early 2000s in Iraq and Afghanistan in U.S. ground wars. The U.S. military would offer what they call salacia or ex gratia payments to civilians who were harmed. Commanders had a lot of discretion in offering these payments, and amounts could vary anywhere from a few $100s to several $1,000s to someone whose loved ones were either injured or killed in U.S. military operations. There wasn't much known about these payments initially until the American Civil Liberties Union did a massive Freedom of Information Act lawsuit and obtained tons of kind of claims forms from the military, which showed what this actually looked like in practice. At the same time, a new organization was founded called the Center for Civilians in Conflict that was advocating for better treatment of civilians and protection of civilians who were harmed in U.S. operations and military operations around the world. So that's where we were in the 2000s. This was something where the military had vast discretion, and they chose to offer these small payments when they injured or killed civilians, basically as part of a counterinsurgency operation. They were a counterinsurgency tool. They saw this as part of winning hearts and minds. In practice, whether or not this was an effective strategy, I think remains to be seen. I just think there's a lot of questions around how this was implemented. I mean, first of all, there's wide variation in payment amounts, as I mentioned. Second of all, there was really no oversight. And there were reports that civilians were actually very angry when they were offered money in exchange for their loved one's death, or by the amounts that they were offered, or by other promises that were made and not followed through on, like saying a commander would come meet with them and apologize, and that didn't happen. So then we fast forward to where we are now. 2014, the U.S. began an air war against ISIS, and we increasingly see the U.S. military shifting from ground operations to air and drone operations, where We don't have troops in country in the same numbers. They're not at the same level of risk. And frankly, counterinsurgency is no longer the dominant paradigm. So instead, the US military is operating from the air, and really does not have a good sense of how many civilians it's harming, and has an even less good sense of what the impacts are on civilians, what their demands are for redress. And so what we see is, even though there was this practice of offering payments in the ground wars in Iraq and Syria, it's really petered out as we shifted to air wars in Iraq, Syria, and other countries. Congress has made efforts to streamline and standardize processes for condolence payments for several years. And this kind of culminated in the end of 2019. Congress finally passed a law officially authorizing $3 million a year, which frankly is a very small amount of money in the military's budget, to offer these condolence payments to civilians. How did we get there? In 2017, there was a really, really important New York Times investigation, actually by two current former ASU affiliates, Azmat Khan and Anand Gopal, who looked at the undercounting of civilian deaths in the air wars in Iraq. And what they found was that, I think that about only 1 in 25 deaths were being counted. They profiled an Iraqi man, Bassem Razo, whose home had been targeted and who lost most of his family in an airstrike, and who was seeking condolence payment, seeking compensation, which is something the military will never officially say it offers because of the legal implications. And after about 1.5 years of advocacy, the military offered him about $15,000. He said, "That's an insult to me." And he said, "No, I don't want that." But this article really galvanized public attention around undercounting of civilian casualties, around its really lack of redress for civilian harm in air wars, and is what led to this new law and the funding authorization of $3 million a year annually for condolence payments. And that's where Zomia and this program come in. Now, I should say before I go any further, I'm a lawyer, and the US military does have very significant legal obligations in terms of how it conducts itself, whether it's in air war or ground operations. And frankly, also has an obligation to provide reparations if an airstrike or a ground raid violates international law, which would include monetary reparations. In practice, it is so unlikely the military is A, going to acknowledge that it's violated international law, and then B, offer any kind of a monetary response, because then that would, be an acknowledgement of war crimes. And so in practice, what we have is this fund, which is completely voluntary, has no admission of legal responsibility, but for civilians who have lost everything in an airstrike, like, depending on the family, a few $1,000s could really mean something. And so Zomia as an organization came in and we looked at what was happening, the fact that there's a $3 million fund from Congress starting in 2020. And in 2020, there was a report to Congress that the military made 0 payments out of this fund. In 2021, there was a report that the military only made 1 payment out of this fund. It was $5,000 in Afghanistan to 1 family. That was it. And so we saw that there was a gap between this massive amount of money compared to what the military is offering. It's tiny compared to the military budget. And then what was actually happening in practice. And so we tried to figure out why, and we founded the Redress Program, which I direct, to try to fill this gap. So our hypothesis is that the military, first and foremost, does not know who it's harming anymore in the same way as soldiers would with air or ground operations, and they were engaging with people in a much more direct way. Even then, there's plenty of cases of them not knowing. But in this case, the victims whose cases even have been documented by outlets like the New York Times or NPR have virtually no way of contacting the military directly. The military doesn't know who they've harmed. And even when they've deemed cases credible, which means that they've acknowledged, yes, it seems very likely we harmed civilians in this case, they still may have no names or contact info for the actual people that they've harmed. And so we began to collect contact information for families who had been interviewed by journalists and others whose cases had already been deemed credible, where there was no dispute that they were harmed. Because this is the low-hanging fruit in terms of getting the military to make these condolence payments. There's no dispute they harmed these people. These cases are somewhat recent. We're talking about from about 2015, 2017 to the present, mostly in Iraq and Syria. There's frankly no reason for the military not to make these payments. There are plenty of families who, may have told a journalist at the time the journalist was doing a story, yes, I'm interested in this form of redress. And then by the time we reached them and said, hi, we actually can help you submit a request to the military, they said, no, it's too late, not interested anymore. But as we contacted families, we found that a lot were still interested. And in fact, we're saying, I've been trying for so many years. Why has it taken so long? Why just to get in touch with someone who could help? Why has it taken so long for the military to respond to me and acknowledge what they did? I lost my child, I lost my home, I lost my ability to support myself because I'm now disabled. There's so many different instances in which A, acknowledgement, and B, even a small amount of money from the military that harmed these families could really make a difference. Other families were much more interested in the truth and finding out which member of the coalition actually dropped the bomb on their home. There's so many ways that we can seek redress. So starting in June 2022, when we formally launched the program, we began to submit cases to the military. We started with the ones I described as credible, where there was no dispute that the military harmed civilians, just to see what would happen. We had done a test the year before, 2021, submitted 2 cases, which sadly were both rejected, although I hope to eventually appeal that decision. But we did that before a really key turning point in terms of where we are with US military practices, which is that in 2022, in January 2022, the Secretary of Defense announced that the military would be launching a new civilian harm mitigation and response action plan. August 2022, put out this plan with these different pillars. Objective 8 of the plan is all about response, how the military actually responds when it acknowledges it has harmed civilians. And it included payments, it included possibly medical support, livelihood support, et cetera. There's a lot of ways that the military is now looking at doing this going forward. So this really opened the door. The military has not made it clear what the time horizon is for the period in which they're willing to actually offer payments. Is an airstrike from 2015, is the family eligible? 2020, is the family eligible? The general policy of Central Command, which manages the operations that at least Zomia is responding to, is that if the military gets new information, they'll reopen an investigation. And so in our cases, everything we're sending them is new information, whether it's that a family is interested in a condolence payment or the fact that they harmed a family at all. We started with these credible cases, as I mentioned, and from there, we've also begun to submit cases to the military where they haven't already found they harmed civilians, but there's new information that should cause them to reopen an investigation or start a new investigation. So we're waiting to see what happens. The military is very bureaucratic. Processes are slow. Over the last year, a big part of my job has been just developing inroads with people in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, which launched this new civilian harm mitigation plan and is setting new policies on how the Pentagon responds and is thinking about how the Pentagon will respond in future conflicts. And I've also been developing close contacts in US Central Command with lawyers and others there who are working on their civilian harm response, who are investigating evidence, investigating cases that I submit evidence for. And we'll see. I will say it feels like the door is open. We haven't gotten a no yet, so that's good. And I think if we do, they know we won't take no for an answer. But this has never really been done before, this kind of sustained effort in trying to get them to use this fund. And we certainly are not doing this alone. We've been working really closely with civil society partners and with the families we represent, of course, who are at the center of all of this. There's a number of organizations that have worked on this for much longer than we have. As I mentioned, the ACLU did FOIA litigation on this, a decade and a half ago. The Center for Civilians in Conflict is a really important partner for us in doing so much of the policy advocacy in DC. The UK-based organization Air Wars is a casualty monitoring organization that has an amazing database, which they've made public, of just every airstrike that they're able to document, whether through open source information, including social media news articles elsewhere, in Syria, Iraq, and a number of other countries. And so we worked really closely with them and other partners to push the Pentagon on the policy issues and trying to get them to have a more humane and thoughtful and legally informed response going forward. And then also to start making payments in these cases we've submitted, which we consider emblematic cases. A lot of them have gotten a lot of news coverage. These are not cases that are under the radar. Some of them maybe, but a lot of them really, the military should already be feeling pressure from other directions as well as feeling it from us now. They're also emblematic because, frankly, the families whose stories have been reported in outlets like the New York Times, which is what led to the CHIMRAP, which has got, Azmat Khan and other New York Times reporters Pulitzer Prizes for their groundbreaking work. Those families sacrifice so much to tell their stories to journalists, to do the painstaking process of pulling together death certificates, photos from the site, GPS coordinates, whatever else they needed to prove that they had been harmed. To me, I think that it's the least the military can do to say, hey, here's $2,000, $5,000 as an apology for what we did. We know you're in need. I think the military owes them so much more. I would love to live in a country where, well, A, where we bomb civilians, B, where if that's viewed as inevitable, there was a real concerted response to do better, to make amends. That's not where we are now, but I know that's the direction that the military intends to go in, and we are just urging them to really think through, how do you have a policy that actually centers the families you're harming? Families say again and again they want compensation. So what does that look like? The military may never call it compensation, but they have the power to do a lot more than they're doing. And again, I think whenever I speak to a family, I set their expectations very low, and I explain these condolence payments are usually just a few $1,000s. Sometimes they've been even less. So, and of course, it's a long process and it's uncertain. I don't know if we're even going to get there. But even that, out of military with billions of dollars, and with $3 million for this, not using that money is a policy choice. And I think that the military can do better. I know we have a lot of time left. I'm glad to maybe open it up for questions, and then I can go on to about other aspects of the program. But let's pause, and Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joanna. This project is really groundbreaking, and it's also exciting to host you here, partly because it has a genesis that's linked to a number of our colleagues, Sarah Holowinski, who's taught with us, who used to be the executive director of Civic and is now at Human Rights Watch, and Anand Gopal, faculty member with us, and Azmat Khan, previously a faculty member with us. We're all part of this process that's gone on for many, many years of trying to draw attention to the civilian impact of the post 9/11 war, specifically the impact of US military operations. And now you have this incredible project, which is odd in the sense that there's millions of dollars sitting there waiting to be used for the purpose of providing condolence payments, however small, to those negatively impacted by US military operations. And yet almost none of this money has been spent in the way that it was intended. So maybe you could walk us through why that's the case. Because obviously it's reasonable for the Department of Defense to want to be sure that those who are receiving the money, can make a legitimate argument that they were harmed by US military operations and not by some other action that occurred during these conflicts. Entirely reasonable. In the past, when there used to be forward operating bases, people could walk over to the base and make their claims, and it was a much more direct, engaged process. But with the air war, we know that there's GPS data. In some cases, DoD released videos that included specific information about attacks, and you and Azmat and Anand and Air Wars and others have put together fairly comprehensive, focused databases that indicate situations where the U.S. government, if they haven't already fully acknowledged that they were responsible, they're at least open to the legitimacy of the claim. So you said all this, but given that, what's the communication problem between information where there really is decent data, dates, GPS locations, clear information about who was impacted, et cetera, and there's a pot of money, and there are obviously people whose job it is to process these claims. Where is the sticking point in those cases?
Great question. So there's a few things, and I will say, we don't know for sure because bureaucracy is opaque and mysterious, but we've gotten some indications over the last year. The good thing is we haven't gotten a no yet, so I'm still optimistic that we'll be able to get some redress for some of the families we represent. So first, I think there's a real issue around political will. There's certainly pressure from Congress on the military to do the right thing here. But I think there's been a narrative, and we've seen DoD spokespeople, go to news reporters and say that they are not interested in offering payments in quote unquote past cases. I always like to push back on the framing of past cases because any airstrike is past as soon as it happens, and the harm is still present for families if there's no response. And frankly, too, a lot of these cases were instrumental in shaping this new civilian harm mitigation plan. So to me, it's really important to be a response to them. But I think that's the first
Quick question,
part
Janet.
is,
So is
yeah.
the current line then of the DoD that these monies were put into place in this policy, uh, that this set of funds is not at all meant to address the harm caused by the post 9/11 conflicts, that it's meant for something other?
So it's definitely intended to address harm we're seeing now in those conflicts. I mean, if they determine they've harmed civilians, I think they feel fully authorized to use the funds for that. The question is how far back you're willing to go, right? I mean, we've, for example, submitted evidence related to the Baghdadi raid of 2019. There was excellent NPR reporting on a man who was severely disabled in the raid. He lost most of one arm and the ability to use the other arm and no longer can support me. 2019, is that too far back? I think because there's new evidence of the harm, like that's, if they determine they agree with us that he's a civilian, I think that's a possible case. But then how far back do we go? Is 2015 too far back? The question is really what their time horizon looks like. Part of
So
the issue
that's
too,
not part of, so the authorization of the monies does not include any guidance on when the funds are, so like what, when the harm took place for these funds to be, potentially allocated.
exactly, which is a good thing because it means we can submit cases from 2015. There's nothing barring us from doing that, especially, again, it takes so long for families to actually get in touch with a lawyer who can do this. But I mean, the other thing too is that, I think the perfect is kind of the enemy of the good here. I've spoken to folks at DoD where they say, but there's so many people we harmed in Mosul, so why these families? They say, well, perfect is the enemy of the good. These families are asking for something. They've taken the trouble of documenting their cases for reporters. They've been publicly reported. You may not be able to help every family, but you could discreetly respond to the request that you're getting, and you have funding to do that. So I think that's another element of it too. I think we see generally with the US government this kind of reticence about looking back. We saw that with torture after 9/11, certainly, right? And there's been no criminal accountability for torture. We see Obama saying, like, we don't torture, but we're not going to look back, prosecute anyone. That's very consistent here, where I think there's reluctance to look back and say, oh, we did this in 2015, and I think there's maybe a fear of a slippery slope. Where does it end? We've reassured Central Command there's not really a slippery slope. We have very finite resources to even bring these cases. There's only a certain number of families whose contact information we or other organizations have. And frankly, there's even fewer families who are really willing to go to the trouble of waiting now, this many years later. Some families just want to close the book on it. So I do think we made inroads with Central Command and talking through that issue. I don't think there's as much of a fear of slippery slope anymore, which is really good. But I do think when we see movement in the cases we've submitted so far, it usually is because there's some kind of media coverage, there's some kind of external attention that really helps. So, and that helps both, I think the political will helps move the bureaucracy. So, because the bureaucracy is doing its thing, I have no doubt that they're still considering these cases somewhere. They're on someone's desk. Who knows at what point we'll get a response. I don't know. I appreciate my main focal points at Central Command. They're pretty responsive to me. They're I think the door is open. We have open channels of communication, and they give me updates when I request them. But I think the challenge really is this question of like, what does it mean to look back? How far does it go? And then also there really is a lot of deference to commanders. That's how this whole practice started, was commanders just using their discretion to literally are carrying around cash and just giving people cash.
Right. They're fun.
And so in this case, because we're talking about air wars where there wasn't necessarily good record keeping, they really might not know what a commander knew about who they'd harmed and whether they were ever presented with a request from a family. It's honestly highly unlikely that a family actually found a way to reach the military at the time of an airstrike and make a request, but because the military doesn't know that and doesn't necessarily know whether or not a payment was considered at the time, I think that also leads to reluctance around doing it now. We
So they're
even
concerned
encourage
about a
them,
sort of
sorry, go ahead.
double payment, the idea that
Or not
some
double payments,
family
but I
might
think
have
about
already.
I think about second guessing a decision. They assume a decision was made not to make a payment if it was never made, when more likely it was just never considered because it wasn't really a tool used in the same way then as it was in the ground wars. It just wasn't on the commander's mind, really. And
Does
so
DoD give you clear ideas of what sort of information needs to be submitted for a case to be reviewed?
we've gotten some clarity on that. Initially, I was using the military's own form. It's called the Salacia form, which they used previously in other cases. I obtained the original Word document with like the DoD metadata, so they would have no doubt this was their form and not mine. And that form really just had basic info, the family's names, contact information, what happened to them, who was harmed, kind of property damage, even though there's no compensation for property damage, just they could still offer a token amount for that. When I submitted that over time, I've gotten feedback that it's better to have everything. And I would already be like offering other evidence, linking to New York Times or other reporting. But basically the messaging I got was it's better to have everything we've collected in terms of death certificate photos, photos of injuries of the dead, GPS coordinates, videos, everything else. And so now my approach is to send everything and then just follow up to make sure it was received, because I don't want to get stuck in their spam filters. But I think my sense is that, again, because new information is really what triggers a new decision, that's sending everything is better for our case anyway, because anything we send will be new information. And then they can do a new review. Even if a commander did make a decision, which they'll never know about because there was no documentation, they can review the information anew now and say, actually, knowing this, having the family's contact information, knowing what happened to them, knowing that this amount of money would mean something to them, and would help buy us some goodwill with them if thinking about strategic interest here, that new information should lead to a different decision.
So briefly, for those in the audience, if everybody has any question, please just drop it into the Q&A box in Zoom, as we always do. Now, in the big picture, what do you hear from families? It has been oftentimes quite a bit of time since an attack, and people have suffered all sorts of really severe ill effects. A few $1,000s is real money, of course, in many parts of Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, but it is unlikely to fully address people's suffering and harm. What are people saying? Are they looking for more money? Are they looking for acknowledgement? Is there a sense you have of your clients, if that's the right word, and where they stand?
Yeah, it's really hard to share the kind of payment thresholds we expect with families whenever I do the initial calls with the family, because when they're thinking about compensation from the richest country in the world, they think they're owed much more, and I do believe morally that they are. It's not the framework we have to work with here policy wise. I mean, we're in an impossible situation of pushing the military to spend money it's already authorized to spend, when frankly there are obligations to offer reparations, right? If there are war crimes, we're not even talking about war crimes. We're not even doing that legal analysis for our cases, even ones that might be IHL violations, international humanitarian law violations, because we just know that's not the paradigm that we have to work in. So it's a hard conversation with a lot of families. I've had families be really shocked and say, how could that be? Is this even worth it? That's such a small amount of money. And even if it's for some families who are in significant financial need resulting from the airstrike, like they want that small amount of money, it really will make a difference. But others, it really is kind of an offensively low amount. And I had one family go back and forth on whether or not they wanted to go forward and wanted me to submit a request for them. And finally, they decided, okay, we're doing this because we want the truth. We want acknowledgement. So, they were asking for money, but it was really about getting a response from the military that harmed them. This woman had lost her husband, and I was on the phone with her and her father-in-law who lost his son. And they were going back and forth, me and my translator, trying to figure out, what do we do? What do we do? And it was the search for the truth that ultimately became most important, and led them to want to go forward. I will say too, the need really depends on what happened. It's just some really, just unbelievably shocking, tragic circumstances. One family, some 35 members of a family were all killed. One woman survived, and she's now trying to support, her much smaller family unit that's still alive. Another family, its daughter was severely disabled in the airstrike, and her medical care is very expensive. And so her parents are thinking about, how do I pay for her medical care each month? Another person we work with, a man who lost part of his leg in the airstrike, it made it a lot harder to find a job. So he's thinking about, how do I support myself now? So there's different questions depending on what happened to the person and what they need. But I think the families that have all decided to move forward, whose cases we've submitted, they know full well what the amounts are like. They may not be thrilled about it, but they still want to see what this huge, powerful actor that harmed them is willing to do for them.
Now, in the event that somebody receives payments, condolence payments, what sort of communication goes along with those payments? Do people hear a formal acknowledgement of responsibility, or a text that suggests some sense of apology? What is it that the U.S. government will communicate to those survivors?
Great question. I don't think there's any norm around it, really. The most prominent example is in the 2017 New York Times article I mentioned. Actually, I'll put that in the chat if it's helpful for those listening. There's a recording that was in a podcast that was kind of linked to this in the Daily. See if I can find that one too. Maybe I'll send it. Can be circulated after. But so there is usually, if it's in this case, it was an in-person meeting. There was an effort to apologize and acknowledge, but I think it really depends.
Will that happen now, though, with current? There's very minimal U.S. deployment in the region, and those who are deployed are not so much, public affairs officers as they are special operators and intelligence officers, right? So, is there much chance that people on the ground will interface with survivors in this sort of manner of presenting a verbal acknowledgement or apology?
I think we would certainly ask for that. It will depend where people are. I think in Iraq, people could probably, could drive to a military base or something. They would arrange a meeting there. They might arrange a car to pick someone up. In different parts of Syria, maybe they'd have a local intermediary that they'd work with, like a local governing council or something, and go through them. We have seen that already in some of the rare payments that are made, where there's kind of an effort to go through local bodies. So I think there's always a way. Yeah, go ahead.
And how do you conceptualize these payments? So they're known as condolence payments, in comparison to other acknowledgements of responsibility, say the commonly used term reparations. And I don't mean just in relationship to war crimes. That's a particular category. It requires usually a legal body, et cetera. But I mean, reparations have also been used in a variety of ways that are not associated with criminal liability. And yet here the government is using a term condolence. So how does condolence compare to, say, reparations, or possibly some other term of acknowledgement of responsibility?
Yeah. There's just a real fear on the part of the military of accidentally acknowledging criminal liability, or acknowledging having broken international law, the laws of war, in an airstrike. And I really don't understand why, because as much as I would love to have an avenue, there just isn't an avenue to hold the military accountable right now for violating the laws of war. There just isn't. And we can see there have been cases that were severe enough to lead to an individual court martial, but those are very rare. And those are normally the bad apples approach, right? It's looking at an individual's conduct versus thinking about systems or training, and how that might have affected the conduct in question. So, I mean, I think the big difference, of course, when you're talking about reparations versus condolence payments, I think from the military standpoint, condolence payments are typically much lower than an amount that would be true compensation in response to an airstrike. I think there may be cases that still warrant, I mean, frankly, I believe in an ideal world, all of these cases would warrant true compensation based on the harm and not whether or not something was legal. That's not the context we have. But there may still be cases, and there have been cases where because of the severity of what happened or public pressure, the military has offered more. Or, or other actors, we've seen the CIA offer more in response to drone strikes. Or there's been rumors of in Yemen, like, oh, there's money that the Yemeni government got and gave to people harmed in a drone strike that most likely did come from the US, but was never formally acknowledged. So I think the big difference is really about this acknowledgement of legal responsibility. I'm not quite sure why there's so much anxiety about it. And the word compensation seems to cause anxiety too, even though it doesn't necessarily have to mean legal obligation. It can, but it doesn't have to. But it still seems to cause a lot of consternation in the conversations I've had with the military. So I say you can use a different term. It's fine. We're talking about payments. When I tell my translator, when I tell them about condolence payments, it's going to be translated as compensation because that's what people understand. I can explain it's not an acknowledgement of legal obligation. It's not anything more than an apology. But people are still going to ask and conceive of it as compensation because I think it's human nature to want compensation when you are wronged.
So is there any role in this whole process of other players, for example, the Iraqi government or neighborhood organizations, or any entity that's not just individuals and their families making a claim to the U.S. Department of Defense?
So there's an Iraq compensation law that's separate from this, and people can also make claims under that. That's broader too because it goes to people harmed, victims of any aspect of the conflict, victims harmed by ISIS to other actors. There's an organization called Ceasefire that has a help desk in Mosul where people can go and get help pulling together all the paperwork they need to submit for this law. There's a lot of paperwork, is my understanding, and the processes are very slow. Outcome also very uncertain. And they've heard rumors of corruption. I'm not sure how often people actually get the payments they're entitled to under Iraqi law.
What sort of payments are covered by the Iraqi compensation scheme as compared to the
In
U.S.
terms of
condolence system?
amounts,
Yes, correct. Yeah.
I think they're a bit lower. I'd have to look back and see. I think we're talking about hundreds of dollars, maybe a few thousand at the most. It's a bit slightly lower than I think the average condolence payment had been for years. The average was around 2,500.
Of U.S. condolence payments.
US dollars, exactly. Yeah. But in terms of thinking about local organizations, I mean, I think in different contexts, there are victims groups that are, that are pushing for change. I would love to, as we go forward, to continue to identify local human rights organizations or victims groups we can work with closely. We've already gotten referrals from some. We have to kind of keep those confidential in terms of where we gotten the referrals. But it's, I think there's always a tension between taking on these individual cases, but then pushing for the broader policy advocacy. And we're really trying to do both here. We want to do right by the specific families we're representing, and we're taking on their cases to move the military more broadly. But to me, because we've taken on someone's case, we really have to ensure we do our best to try to get justice for them, however they're conceiving of it, and also see if there are other ways we can help them. A lot of these families are asking for condolence payments because they're in need. So we have already tried to, succeeded in helping at least a few of the families we're representing with medical care, some livelihood support, and we're going to continue doing that in the coming year and try to scale that part of the program up.
So how do you feel? You've worked on the project now for almost 2 years, is that correct?
Let's say a year and a half.
A year and
A
a
year
half.
and a half full time.
So how does it feel? Like, how do you assess where you are now in relationship to where you thought you'd be and where you see this going forward? It's obviously a long haul, and there's lots of uncertainties as to how the condolence payment system will evolve.
Right.
So what's your general sense?
I think I'm really happy with where we are in terms of the open door with the military. I think we've done a lot of good relationship building with folks on the inside in the last year and a half. They trust Zomia now. They trust our program. They know if we submit evidence to them that it's going to be vetted, it's going to be really solid, and they'll take it seriously. So even though we don't have really clear outcomes from our cases yet, I think that's a really good indication. We've had them proactively reaching out with questions now. So it's not just us reaching out. It's a two-way street now, which is great. Then in terms of civil society advocacy, I mean, we've just been completely welcomed by the US and global civil society space working on civilian harm issues and specifically focusing on the US and other coalition members. It's been transformative to work with all these different groups, and at this key time where the military has a new civilian harm mitigation plan, and we can really feed into it. Send them documents that we hope that they will simply copy and paste into their policy proposals. We'll see. So that's been really good too. I mean, I'm really hopeful that in the next year we will be able to get more for the families we represent. We've had small advocacy victories on the way. Smaller things we've been able to do to support families in specific cases. Responses from the military where we never thought we'd hear a response. I mean, one key example is the Baghdadi raid, which was reported, the civilian harm in that raid was reported by NPR in 2019. We sent the military a letter in May of 2022 saying, hi, we're representing the civilian who was harmed. Will you reopen the investigation based on new evidence? It took 13 months, but we did get a reply. And now the military is saying they're looking at the evidence we've submitted. So that's huge. That's one of the most high profile, difficult cases we have, and we have gotten a response and at least some acknowledgement so far. So I'm not ready to give up.
Could you talk a little bit about the Civilian Harm Mitigation Response Action Plan, which was a key announcement of the Secretary of Defense, so it came from the very highest levels of the DoD, and how what it says and what its possibility for constructing a regime that would operate more appropriately and more effectively to mitigate civilian harm.
And so the CHIMRAP, as we call it, the military always has their acronyms, really is a comprehensive plan that, if implemented well, will hopefully change for the better how the military responds to civilian harm. And it's the result of 2 decades of advocacy after 9/11, after the US response to 9/11 in Iraq and Afghanistan by a number of groups and survivors. So it's really tremendous. It looks at every aspect from how the military targets civilians and improving how the military targets civilians by mistake, I should say. That's theoretically something the US doesn't do intentionally. But how the military, what their targeting practices look like, how they investigate civilian harm, what their data management looks like. And then, of course, the piece that Zomia is most concerned with, how they respond to civilian harm. And that includes all of the nuts and bolts we've talked about in terms of going down to, if you're making a payment to someone, do you meet with them in person? Do you apologize? Do you issue a public statement? What does the redress look like? And how do you do the consultation to know what families actually want? And it can be very complicated. I think anyone who's dealt with any kind of loss in their own family knows that grief can tear families apart. So it may be that there are different members of a family who fundamentally disagree about what they want, and maybe they want different representatives to advocate for them. It may be that they can't come to a consensus on it. It's complicated. So, and the way that the military conceives of family units too in itself can be problematic, because I think it's kind of nuclear family unit, parents and children, this American ideal, for better or for worse, of what a family looks like. And that's not true in a lot of other cultures, including many that are part of the American fabric. So, the military, I have cases where I'm representing a sibling of someone who died, or their niece or nephew, and the person was very important to them. The question is that even part of the military's frame of reference for who is owed this, I guess not owed is the wrong word, who they would offer this sympathy payment.
So is the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan, has it evolved to the degree where there's clarity on these types of issues, so that there's now DoD policy that explains sort of what an official family unit is, or what sort of evidence is required to make a legitimate claim for condolence payments? So is this all been formalized, or what's the state of these, the intention of creating a system that would operate better?
So we and our civil society partners have shared guidance in all these questions that we hope that will be taken to heart based on our long, extensive conversations among ourselves and also with families and others who are impacted by conflict. We've shared all this with the military. We understand that they're in the drafting phase now. I think they're a bit behind on everything that's laid out in the CHMRAP timeline, but they are. So there is interim guidance on condolence payments they issued in response to this law that created this $3 million fund. It's a lot of problems, but at least it exists. That's being revised now, and we are really looking forward to seeing the new guidance, and we hope that the feedback we've given them will be implemented. So we hopefully will see that guidance, and then there will be broader guidance around all these other granular things. I don't know how much will be public versus how much will be internal, but we're definitely engaging with them in all these granular questions.
And how about there's supposed to be a center of excellence that's created as part of this policy? Does that seem like something promising? And what do you know about what that would be and how it would operate?
So the Center of Excellence does exist. I think my understanding is they have office space in Virginia. I don't know a lot about how they're operating yet. I think they're trying to staff up right now. Last I heard, they were hiring. If there's folks on the call who are looking to work from the inside on improving U.S. civilian harm policies. But I think they're supposed to have a big staff, and they're supposed to really be, I think, kind of almost like a, but it's not say quite like a think tank, but I think they're really going to be producing a lot of the thinking on this stuff, and that's the main goal. It remains to be seen. I think it's great if there's more staff on this, because frankly, the fact that it's taken a year and a half and we still haven't gotten a response in some of our requests, I think they're probably very short-staffed, and it's only a few people until now who have been leading the civilian harm response. So I think it can only be a positive thing, but let's wait and see.
So more broadly, obviously the question of civilian harm extends far beyond the particular policies that the DoD has put into place, recently, and how they're managing this pot of money, which is $3 million a year over a projected 10 years. So $30 million, which is significant money in the developing world. But leaving all that aside, what sort of lessons do you feel there are for the many raging conflicts around the world where civilians are being purposefully targeted? And even if you want to be generous and suggest that that's not the case, there seems to be little to any interest in the mitigation of civilian harm.
Yeah. Sorry, what's the question?
Fair enough.
How do I respond?
Well, what sort of lessons, here you have the United States government with its, the post 9/11 wars are fading away, right? And so I can understand there's a lack of interest in going back in time and sort of thinking about things that have happened, even if in fact it seems like a super appropriate time to use a pot of money designed to offset harm for harm that's relatively well documented. But what about moving forward? I mean, what are the lessons, say, that the world can take from this process? It sounds to me kind of cumbersome, bureaucratic, and not especially effective in a world where we're seeing civilians being targeted in multiple major conflicts around the world. What lessons from the U.S. response, can be learned from a larger global society?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first and foremost thing I will say is that many victims will want compensation, will want and expect monetary compensation for harm that they experience. And we see now in the context of Ukraine, there's discussion about reparations, about using seized Russian assets for reparations, about having a registrar of damages, all of the complexities of working with victims that we're experiencing at a kind of a micro level, we multiplied many times over in that context. So I think those lessons are really important, and we're eager to share those with partners who are working in other conflicts. And that's actually part of how we're conceiving with the program going forward. In terms of the U.S. response, I mean, I think it shows, here we have a military that is ostensibly very committed to preventing civilian harm, which has still made egregious errors again and again, and frankly has system problems with how it's targeting that have not been addressed. We really hope will be addressed in the future. And this is the best case scenario, right? There's plenty of militaries that are not even trying to prevent civilian harm. It's not even part of their policy.
Or intentionally targeting civilians as part of strategy.
Or intentionally targeting civilians, right, as a tool of warfare. Yeah, for sure. And so I think it just underscores the challenges of holding any military accountable. I think, again, I'm still optimistic that we will see some movement in the next year. But the fact that Congress has said, hey, here's $3 million, take it and run with it. And the military said, no, we're not really that interested. it's really disappointing. I mean, these families are owed so much more than this. They've lost everything. And it's just by virtue of living in the wrong place at the wrong time. It's just, it was okay for them to be targeted, but not you or me. It's just, it's so arbitrary. So I think there are lessons here, though, around the fact that there has been significant documentation that has led to policy change, and that it was pressure from advocacy groups for many years. And it was this, it was the documentation of harm that's led to this. There's still such a mismatch between documentation and then results for those families. And that's something as a human rights lawyer I struggle with a lot, where if you're the one who's doing the documentation, and really chronicling what has happened to a family, that piece of research is not necessarily going to lead to change for that family. The hope of this program is that we can take what's been documented by others and actually get results for specific families, because they've given so much of themselves and being willing to document their case. But that's really hard. And in a context where you're seeing like wide scale conflict, it's so much harder for families who are taking, who are able to even, documentation itself is a huge challenge, but families who are able to do that, it's so much harder for them to get amends.
Do you think that there's any possibility for this work to evolve towards greater focus on truth telling coupled with an acknowledgement that doesn't necessarily require, the transfer of ultimately relatively small amounts of money? That is to say, would a project be potentially more successful if it was based on truth telling and gathering, rigorous information about human suffering in the context of war, where the goal was to gain, a type of acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement might be more general or might therefore reach a larger group of survivors who, given the extraordinary destruction that was part of the post 9/11 wars, then of course the anti-ISIS campaign that leveled cities like Raqqa and destroyed significant parts of Mosul and other areas.
Yeah. No, I think it's another really important component. I don't think it can replace the demands and needs of survivors. And as I mentioned, so many do want individual monetary compensation. That's just what we hear again and again, and what our partners hear too. But it's a key component of all of this. And some of our partners, like I mentioned, Air Wars, are already doing that documentation work. That then if they submit all the evidence they have to the military, that may trigger a new investigation. And I will say, even in some of the cases we have, there are families for like that acknowledgement is such an important piece. You're talking about acknowledgement both at an individual but a collective level too. And I think one of the things I really want to do in this program going forward is look at the lessons learned from transitional justice processes and think through, like, when we're talking about redress in these places and we're working with specific families, what is the ask more broadly? What should we be asking the US military? What should we be asking US aid? And the military is very interested in community response. It's a huge part of objective aid at the CHIMRAP. And actually, it's an area where we as civil society have had to push back and say, look, community responses, quote unquote, that we've seen so far in Iraq often lead to corruption. Money isn't actually reaching the right people. It's a great example of the Dutch in response to a mass casualty event in Hawija, Iraq, during an airstrike, where they targeted a car bomb factory, and there was horrific damage to the area, and many civilians were killed. The Dutch set up these development programs with two different international bodies, and then the survivors went to The Intercept, the news publication, and said, hi, we didn't receive anything. We didn't even know this was happening. So there can be such a huge mismatch between this kind of collective responses and then what people actually want and need, that I think it's a conversation we want to continue to be part of, and we want to think through, what does redress mean? And frankly, I think we'll see going forward. Our target right now is the U.S. government, as in terms of advocacy. That's our main target. There's a lot of potential there for us to look at other conflicts going forward beyond, like you said, the post 9/11 wars. But we'll see. I feel very strongly we need to keep advocating too for the families we're already representing, and see what we can get for them.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna. Are there any final words you have about the broader implications of this work, and what you've maybe learned from your work on this project? And just moving forward, you obviously have a great deal of energy and passion despite all the frustrations. So, what maybe final thoughts do you have for us on the general terrain of seeking
Yeah.
redress for survivors of these U.S. military actions?
I'll say two things. One is that what I've learned so far, I've been a human rights lawyer now for 5 years. Advocacy takes a long time, and have to be patient and persevere. And sometimes you're passing the baton to someone else eventually. And in my case, I think I've been building on the work other people have been doing for some 20 years. It takes a long time. You do see results. And for us, we've had a number of small victories this year that were real victories where we pushed the government on one thing. And I think having those kind of finite demands, like we do now, we're saying, hey, we're just asking for a few $1,000s, is really key to being effective sometimes. We're not saying overhaul everything you're doing in response to civilian harm. We're saying, hey, offer this family some money, right? So that's one thing, is advocacy takes a long time, but there are small victories. And the other is just that it's really an honor to get to work so closely with families who are willing to trust their trauma and their stories with another person, with an outside organization, with an attorney. And so getting to know the families that we represent has been key for me to grounding myself in the work and staying centered and feeling good about what we're doing, and also keeping my eyes on the horizon of what's most important here. This is about real people. This is about their stories. They live with this every day. And I think for me, even getting the chance to know one family really well in the last year has just opened my eyes to every time any military in the world drops a bomb on, say, an apartment building. And we know this is happening right now. How many people's lives are going to be destroyed by this? But then also, it will lead to a new fight for justice too. And I hope that the powerful, unaccountable militaries in the world know that we're not giving up on that, and we will still continue to find new ways to hold them accountable.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. Have a good night.
Good night. Thank you.